conference, so appreciate you coming along to this ResPublica and ESB event and indeed debate on how to keep the lights on at the lowest cost to the taxpayer. Got a great panel, so hopefully some lively debate this lunchtime. To my far left is Andrea Leadsom, Minister of State for Energy and Climate Change. To my immediate left is Claire Duffy, General Manager UK of ESB. To my right is Rian Kelly, Business Environment Director at the CBI. And to my far right is Professor Jim Watson, who's Research Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. Clearly, the whole energy question is never out of the news, whether it's Drax deciding to end its 1 billion carbon capture project, whether it's EDF trying to find Chinese partners for its nuclear programme in Hinkley. There are key issues to talk about. Each of the panellists will talk for about 5 minutes first, and then we'll open the floor for questions and hopefully some great answers. Lots of topics to talk about: subsidies, renewables, coal in the Times this morning, and the most important question of how we keep that sort of energy security at the lowest cost to taxpayers. So without further ado, Andrea.
Thank you. Well, great to be here, and my first Fringe meeting as Energy Minister, and it was only about, I'm going to say, a couple of months ago that I felt brave enough to go and talk in public on a subject that is quite as complicated and in many ways controversial as energy. And so the first thing I want to say is that the title of the topic for today, Keeping Lights On at Lowest Cost, are only two legs of our three-legged stool, or what's more often known as our trilemma. And those three legs are keeping the lights on, keeping the bills down, but also decarbonising. And I think that is the big challenge, the really intrinsic challenge for energy. And for me, as someone who comes from a finance background, it's actually, in the UK, we're rather akin to where we are in banking, which is that we have a whole load of baggage and a whole load of infrastructure that was created for an earlier environment. So like in banking, you know, we've got these branch networks and we've got all these ancient sort of paper-based systems and downloads and so on. Whereas when you look at the developing world, because they don't have any of that infrastructure, they can simply get on with mobile payments. And likewise, when you look at the energy world in the UK, we have a national grid that was built for a former age that doesn't deal well with multiple, even domestic level feed-in to the grid. We've got all sorts of challenges with the opportunities from new renewables, new technologies, on how we can actually keep our lights on whilst at the same time keeping the incentive for new renewables. So we've got the whole problem of intermittency to solve. So there's enormous investments, potentially £100 billion of investment in our energy infrastructure just in the few years ahead. So, but what I want to say first of all is we are totally committed to meeting each of the three goals of our trilemma. So the overarching vision is to decarbonise. We've got to move to a clean energy future. There's no doubt about that. Even if you don't believe in climate change, for me, the CO2. Are we all right? Do we need to get more chairs? Do you want me to?
I don't know, but will there be space for more chairs?
We'll just carry on.
But if whoever's sort of nearest to the door could kind of play door monitor, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
There's two at the front if anyone wants to sit down. And there's a couple of spares.
Yeah, two here. And there's one here. And one there. So decarbonisation is essential. We are legally committed to it, and of course we know fossil fuels don't have a permanent future. We also know that there's a lot of needless deaths from fumes and emissions in the air, and of course we also know that CO2 may, depending on your view, be impacting on the climate change that we're undoubtedly seeing. For me, I come upon it as someone who believes in insurance. If there's a chance that the CO2 emissions that we're putting into the air at extreme and exponentially growing rates are potentially to blame for climate change, then it's worth paying a significant insurance premium to try and ensure that we limit its impact. And I think that is an argument that can hold whether you believe in CO2 being a man-made contributor to climate change or not. So essentially decarbonisation is the big picture, but the smaller picture of keeping the bills down and the essential overarching goal of keeping the lights on are what drives us in DEC and will continue to drive us. And just a couple of points about where we are now. We're seeing coal reducing. It's now around 30% of our energy sources depend on coal. Gas is increasing from around 25% to around 30% of our energy needs. Nuclear in the last year has reduced slightly, but it's still around 20%, so those old nuclear power plants are still essential, and renewables are also around 20%. So those are the figures, and those really, when you look on it from that point of view and you look at the decarbonisation impact of reducing coal and increasing gas, potentially reducing coal by 1% and increasing gas by 1% gives you as much of a decarbonisation effect as increasing our current stock of renewables by 10%. So actually, moving to a decarbonised future, it will be essential to pass away from coal and into gas as we improve our renewables and our infrastructure to cope with them, and of course the storage to deal with the intermittency. So that, by way of background, I think is absolutely essential to understand that the future cannot be, from where we are today, moving to a world of renewables only. And I think some of the press recently where people talk about we've got to get rid of fossil fuels and just move straight to wind are completely failing to see the fact that 80% of our heating in the UK is at the moment gas central heating. We cook with it, we use it for heating, we use it in a lot of our chemical processes. So gas is an essential part of our future, at least for the next 20 or 30 years. And so what we've got to do is to take a sensible approach, an incremental approach to moving to a future of decarbonisation. Some of the big challenges that we face, the North Sea basin and the oil and gas production from the North Sea is reducing. We've put in place the Oil and Gas Authority, whose job it is to maximise the economic recovery from the North Sea. We definitely need to continue to promote and encourage exploration and new production in the North Sea for the next 20 or 30 or even more years. We've got to move away from unabated coal and into gas as a bridge to renewables. We've got to manage the cost of renewables. They are still extraordinarily expensive. And as you've seen, we've had to reduce some of the subsidies, consulting on cutting others. And what we want to do is to continue to encourage the growth and development of renewables technologies, not just the ones we have, the onshore wind, the solar and the offshore wind, but also the newer technologies. But as soon as we can, we've got to get them to stand on their own 2 feet, because obviously the more renewables that we deploy, the bigger the impact on the bill payer, who pay for the subsidies that are necessary to keep renewables going. So you can argue about at what point renewables reach grid parity in terms of a levelised cost of energy. You can argue about when that is, but what I don't think anyone should argue about is that there should continue to be a bottomless pit of bill payers' money that's available to continue to subsidise that sector. It has to stand on its own 2 feet as soon as it possibly can. So all we're discussing is when that is, not whether it should happen. So producing gas, at the moment in the UK, we import around 40% of our gas needs from places like the Middle East and Russia, and by 2030 it's likely that we'll be importing around 75% of our gas. So another policy area, a big challenge for the UK, is to see what we can do with shale. I'm a huge fan of at least exploring whether we can extract gas from our own shale resources. We haven't even got that far yet. So what we've been doing in government is looking very closely at what more we can do to promote the idea of shale, to deal with the very real, very valid concerns of local communities around the safety of them, and looking at some of the lessons in the US. But the fact is, we've been exploiting oil and gas onshore and offshore for over 50 years. We have some of the toughest regulation in the world. We have really looked very carefully at the case for shale, and we do believe it would be mad not to at least give it a go. So you'll see a lot more about the UK government promoting shale as a means to energy security and towards that bridge towards decarbonisation in the future. Nuclear, of course. Got to have a word on nuclear. There has been no investment in nuclear in the UK for decades. We are now embarking on the first new nuclear project with Hinkley C. We expect that to get signed in the next few weeks. We're hopeful when the Chinese state visit takes place next month that it will be signed then. But certainly we are fully committed to that, not only to that, but to several other nuclear projects in the future. We're looking very carefully at how to finance those. Very important that we get that right at the fair cost to the consumer, but bearing in mind that nuclear is not only very low carbon, but it also is a vital provider of the base load of energy that we desperately need to secure. And then finally, of course, the new technologies. And this is something where a conservative energy policy will absolutely focus on, number one, transparency and clarity for investors, so that businesses can see what makes sense for them to get stuck into, whether it's new nuclear, whether it's tidal, whether it's carbon capture and storage, whether it's older projects, so whether it's CCGT plants, whether it's investing in bringing projects out of mothball to provide energy security. What we want to do with a new conservative policy is to provide the certainty to investors going forward, but also to provide clarity about what the subsidies will do for them, so that we don't end up again in a situation as we have now, where the subsidy was assumed to continue regardless of the level of deployment. And of course, when you reach a point that you are costing your bill payers far more than anyone ever envisaged, you have to put a stop to it. And that, of course, has damaged investor confidence very regrettably, but I think only for the very short term. I'm extremely positive and hopeful for the future. We're fully committed to renewables. We're fully committed to the new technologies. We want to invest in research and development, potentially with other countries, but certainly the UK is a world leader in offshore wind. We intend to be a world leader in carbon capture and storage. I would love to see us take on a new role, particularly if small modular reactors could prove to be deliverable in some of the nuclear technologies. We're already a world leader in decommissioning. So actually, the UK has a bright future for energy, a very bright future. And I think what we all need to do, whether we're in the old industries or the new industries, is to see that there is a journey from where we are today, literally to use that wonderful Irish joke about if you're wanting to go there, I wouldn't be starting from here. When you're giving someone directions. Sorry if anyone's Irish and highly offended by that. Oh, there we go. Are you offended by that? Sorry. But the point is, we are on a journey. And so we've got a lot of baggage from old technologies. And we're moving to a new world. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of possibility. We're going in the right direction. And certainly for this government, it'll be essential that we take businesses with us so that they can also be very clear about what they want to invest in. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrea. And from the perspective of one of those businesses that needs to be taken with, Claire.
Yes. So I just wanted to start by setting the scene and to really begin by talking about power demand. And if you look over the last number of years, power demand in GB has been either flat or it's falling. And that has been due to the recession, to improvements in energy efficiency, and to the rapid rise of small-scale distributed generation, which in itself then looks like negative demand to the greater system. And I think that we're not really going to see a change in that pattern over the next number of years. And I suppose other than perhaps if there's some decarbonisation of transport, which might facilitate electric vehicles, although I think that's some time away, I think the demand is essentially going to be flat or falling in the near future. And when you think about the generation mix that we have in GB, that's about coal, gas, renewables and nuclear, approximately a quarter of each. But I think when you have to think about it in terms of the thermal and nuclear that will be closing over the next number of years, over the next decade, a significant portion of coal and nuclear, notwithstanding that there might be some further extensions on nuclear, will be closing in the next period. And if you think that Carrington, which is ESB's plant, which is being built actually just a couple of miles from here in Carrington, outside on the outskirts of Manchester, it's the only new build combined cycle gas turbine being built at the moment. And that is one that has been built and will be due for commercial operation next year. But as I say, it's the only one that has been built because really there hasn't been any sort of market signals coming through. And that is due partly to the rapid rise of renewables in the market that has depressed and has reduced wholesale electricity market prices. That combined with poor wholesale market liquidity has meant that you haven't seen the market signals for new investment coming through. So I suppose when we think of what has been built in the last number of years, a significant portion of that has been new renewables, and that's largely been constructed on the back of government subsidies. And although in the last number of months there have been changes to that regime and the level of support, I think if you look at what the main challenge will be now in the future, it's how to keep the lights on and against the backdrop of thermal and nuclear closing, and how to do that efficiently. And I suppose if we think in the last while, there have been a number of real innovations in the last while with the auctions on the CFDs and the capacity market. And I suppose, you know, it is very early at this stage to maybe comment on the broader side of whether or not they have been successful. But if we look at it and we see the outturn prices that come from those auctions, they have been significantly less than what was, you know, thought or considered from the government and from other commentators and analysts. So I suppose from that very simplistic sort of viewpoint, you might think that that has been good value for the consumer. And if you contrast that with some of the administered schemes, so we've had administered schemes that we've had for support of some of the renewables, it's been a bit unclear really. The consumer outcomes have been a little bit unclear, and the costs have certainly been higher. And I suppose you might consider some of the FID enabling schemes that were in place prior to the CFD auctions, and if you compare that, you might look and say, well, you know, where has been the best value for consumer? And you know, there are commentators out there too. I know the nuclear has not yet been signed, but there are commentators who might consider whether the FID contract for that has been the best value for money. But I suppose just in recapping, I just want to comment that in our mind, I suppose the auction arrangements seem to have produced better value for the consumer compared to the administered schemes. And that's on the cost side. But I think we also have to consider that the capacity auction was brought in to also encourage new investment. And the jury is still out, I suppose, on that and whether that's going to be achieved. We have still yet to see the financial close of the one combined cycle gas turbine that was successful in last year's auction. And as I say, you know, we'll have to look and see, will the capacity auction in its current form, will it bring on the new investment that's required, or will we see a proliferation of the low-cost capital projects that peakers that are much more higher emitting than their combined cycle gas turbines, and we may see that the combined cycle gas turbines are left to the margins.
Yep, so I'll start by saying we've got a major investment challenge on our hands, and I guess it's always talked about and it's almost become a bit of a cliche, but we need in the power sector a great vast amount of private sector investment into building new generation capacity, and in many ways that sort of dictates the policy landscape that we're currently in and in which we're operating. We're going to lose all but one of our nuclear power stations by the middle of the 2020s. A lot of coal is coming offline, and we're sort of gas is being mothballed, and some of the signals coming through don't necessarily mean that there's lots of gas coming back online. And we're not always replacing like for like either. As Andrea said, we've got a sort of new trilemma against which we need to balance these new investments. We need them to be low carbon, secure and affordable. So we're asking for a different type of mix going forward, something that's more diverse and lower carbon. Again, then getting this right is absolutely crucial to the business community. We do a yearly infrastructure survey and we ask about how businesses would rank decarbonisation, affordability and security. And we're just about to put that survey out for this year. And actually, above all, businesses have said security is a real problem for them, and their major concern in the trilemma is something they need to get right. I think against that backdrop, though, it is fair to say there's been quite a lot of progress in the last couple of years. We've made real progress, particularly on the Energy Act, which came into place in 2013 and was important in delivering the implementation of electricity market reform. Claire, you referred to contracts for difference and the capacity market. We've had both. We've had a first round of the capacity auction, and we've had 2 rounds of the CFD now. We've got investment being talked about, hopefully signed, for Hinkley Point C and other nuclear power plant like in Wilfer and Moorside coming online. Q2 in 2015 this year also saw share of generation from renewables and nuclear hit 46.9%, about 30% for gas and the rest being made from coal, and oil, so a sort of shift in the way in which we understand our energy mix. And we've seen a positive strategy coming forward on shale gas. I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet, and it won't necessarily contribute to reducing bills, but it can play a role in providing an additional source of gas and reduce our import reliance. And then I think the other thing to flag in terms of progress is that ahead of the election we had a commitment from 3 party leaders to climate change goals, to decarbonisation future, and I think an important signal. So none of these are small achievements and should all be recognised and are important for the business community. But all of that said, there are certainly challenges, and policy uncertainty is adding to risk for business investors at the moment. I think the question now is, do we still have the right climate to deliver the uptick in capacity margins that we need in the medium term? We can't get away from the fact that some of the recent changes to policy have actually undermined investor confidence. We represent at the CBI pretty much every business in the energy space, so we have some of the big oil and gas majors, we have some of the big energy users, we have the investors, we have people with particularly new emerging technologies, we have people who are independent generators. And whilst individual policies might affect them in different ways and they have sort of different gripes with particular changes, the one thing that binds all of them together is the speed and the scale and the approach that's been taken in the last couple of months, and honestly it's shaken their nerves quite considerably. We absolutely agree that we cannot be charging ahead into a low carbon future that's going to cost the earth, and absolutely we can't allow costs to spiral out of control, and generators and technologies must aim to stand on their own 2 feet when it's most feasible. So absolutely welcome the focus on costs, but it is also important to take a long-term view, that making decisions now might lower bills today, but actually if you push that out 10 years it might actually increase costs. So we need to take not just a short-term view but a medium long-term view on the affordability question. And I guess onshore is maybe a little bit of an example of this, that it's clear that it was in your manifesto, there's absolutely a political mandate then to deliver the manifesto commitment. But we also, I guess, need to recognise some of the trade-offs in doing that, and that by removing the cheapest form of renewables, it doesn't necessarily help us deliver the most cost-effective energy mix in the future, and we need to think about how we manage that balance appropriately. I guess the other thing that sort of comes to mind in this discussion, particularly around security, is it's not just a question of power generation. It also ought to be a discussion around energy efficiency, which I think is really important to managing our security over the longer term. And what we've seen in the energy efficiency space is sort of rolling back on certain schemes like a commitment to zero carbon homes, which actually means it's cheaper to build a zero carbon home now, but ultimately these homes are still going to need to be retrofitted in the future, and so that will probably come at a higher cost sometime in the future. So then what do we need? What are the answers? Well, clear and consistent and long-term plan for the future. On the investment side, we need broad, stable, consistent, transparent policy. We need to take a long-term view, and power sector needs to understand which technologies are going to be put forward in the future, which technologies are going to have the necessary support, even if it's ramped down over time. And then what's the funding envelope look like, particularly post-2020, when much of the investment that's being made now, the technologies and the power generation capacity won't come online until into the 2020s. And you made a point around transparency. I think that's quite important with things like the levy control frameworks. One of the things we hear from businesses is that whilst we understand the levy control framework has reached its limit, and we've seen the OBR numbers, many businesses don't actually quite understand how those numbers were reached. And I think that then what you get is you taking the right decisions to make sure that we manage the levy control framework, but it becomes a political risk. And if there's greater transparency and greater understanding about how we're reaching the limits, then actually it can become a business risk, and businesses are best able to manage that risk themselves and judge what investments they can make, but it becomes their risk, not political risk, and I think that's the system we need to go back to. I think on the energy efficiency, I would also say on the costs, about managing household costs and managing business costs. clearly we ought to be focused on supporting this transition for the most vulnerable households, but it is also a question about thinking about those businesses that are most exposed, most energy intensive and trade exposed, and seeing what we can do to make sure that we manage it for them. And in many cases, those businesses are making things like cement or aluminium or steel, and actually cement, aluminium, steel help us deliver the capacity we need, help us deliver the low carbon secure investments we need, so we don't actually want to offshore them. On the energy efficiency, I think what we need is clear proactive focus on this, and on a sort of refreshed strategy for households, so we understand how we'll replace green steel and what the future of the eco scheme is. And then on the business side, we've had lots of good initiatives in the last 5-10 years, but from a business perspective, navigating through that to take the right investment decisions is quite tricky. So the simplification process that's going on now is really welcome, to have one reporting regime, one incentive regime and one regulatory regime. Businesses will be able to use that to their advantage to make the right investments. And I think the final point then is, I guess the backdrop to the conversation right now is the climate change talks in Paris at the end of the year. And they will be important for sending a clear steer to investors that to keep investing. But I guess global ambition abroad must be matched with consistency at home. So I think what we need is a positive plan that sets out an assessment of the UK's needs, an understanding of the technologies that will play a part in delivering those needs, and that is then something that the business community will be able to invest against.
Finally, Jim.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel. So the title is about how we can keep the lights on at lowest possible cost. Clearly, keeping the lights on becomes often a shorthand for energy security in media debates, and there's a rather well-worn media cycle every autumn where we get headlines about the lights about to go out, and it's usually, well, sometimes it's about, well, somebody somewhere wants to build something, or somebody wants to get support for a particular option. I think the difference between that debate and the reality is that, yeah, clearly the lights haven't gone out for most people, and where they have, it's to do with faults on the distribution network, such as in the storms the Christmas before last, rather than a lack of power stations to meet demand. So I think perhaps we just have to inject a little bit of realism into this discussion. Of course, no system is 100% secure, so we may have problems with the network, but certainly at the moment we've been okay. Having said that, I fully agree with the Minister and what she said about having to keep the lights on in a way that reduces emissions. There's no good actually putting in place a strategy to get into a more comfortable position where the risks are lower when actually we're increasing emissions. So we need to do both at the same time. So prolonging the life of coal plants, or bringing in diesel backup generators and things like that, which may get us through a few tight spots over the next couple of years, is not really a good medium or long-term strategy, and so I was really glad to hear that those two things were brought together. I'd reinforce what other speakers have said, really, that the electricity system is changing. We have this legacy the Minister talked about. Demand is falling. It peaked more than 10 years ago for electricity, same for energy. Renewables are growing, they're now 20% and more of electricity. Old plants are closing, as others have said. So I agree, we do have a big investment challenge now to kind of renew our infrastructure and respond to those changes, and doing it in a way that works now rather than what worked in the 1960s when a lot of our infrastructure was built. But lots of investments have been made as well. The infrastructure investment challenge is not all in the future. Actually, in the last few years we've invested a heck of a lot. So I think perhaps we just have to look at the data. Yes, it is tight over the next couple of years. If you look at the National Grid assessments, and the ones by Ofgem, the regulator, they say it's tight. The House of Lords Science and Technology Committee, which I advised earlier in the year, came out and said, well, yes, we're probably okay, but it shouldn't really have got to this position where it is so tight. So we need to think about what we do. So then on to the policy prescriptions and what we need to do. I think there's quite understandably a separation between what you do to get yourself through the next 1 or 2 years, the tight spot, and what you do for the more medium-term future. And that's where I think UK policy, at least on paper, has got it roughly right. The National Grid has extra balancing services, so it can call plants out of semi-retirement if it needs to. It can sign contracts with businesses to reduce their demand or call on backup generation to balance supply and demand of the next 2 winters. They had such contracts in place last winter. They weren't needed. None of them were needed, partly because the weather was warm. I think they're more likely to be needed this winter, but that remains to be seen. I think the important thing about that is we had both supply side and demand side together making those arrangements. Further ahead, we've heard about the capacity market. I too have questions about whether it's really going to deliver investment in new plant which are needed to balance the system, particularly gas. At the moment we have that one plant, but as you said earlier, it hasn't reached financial close. But alongside that, as has been said earlier, we have those contracts for differences for low carbon generation of a number of kinds going on. Many things have been funded. I agree with those who say that some of those deals were quite expensive, so I also agree that we need to be worried about costs. But for me, I think the concern of the announcements over the last few months is managing that transition towards the point where XY technology is not dependent on subsidies. And I think that's a really tough job for government, how to do that in timing, often with a lack of information about what the real costs are. But I think managing that transition right is going to be very, very important. Just a word on gas per se. I think gas is important as a bridge to a cleaner future. We have to be a bit careful not to talk that up too much, because in the UK we're already well over our bridge. We abandoned coal-fired, or at least coal gas heating in the 1970s and 80s. We've actually shifted from coal to gas a lot in the 1990s. There's some way to go with that, but we certainly don't have as much mileage as other countries. With respect to gas, I'm relatively relaxed about the security implications. We actually don't get much of our gas from Russia, despite popular opinion. It's less than 5%. Most of our gas imports come from Norway and Qatar in the Middle East, and we still have, as the Minister said, quite a lot of gas from the North Sea. I'm agnostic about shale. Yes, by all means, let's explore for it, but don't let's expect it to actually solve all our problems. For me, it really remains to be seen what the cost of that shale is going to be. And if that cost is lower than gas from anywhere else, we'll probably use a lot of it. If it's higher, we won't. It's as simple as that. So on to the future. I thought it was interesting in the announcement about the National Infrastructure Commission just yesterday, that actually one of its focuses on energy is not on how do you get investment in new big power plants, but actually it's quite interested in large-scale storage, in interconnection and in flexible demand. And I think that's really key, that any future policy framework building on what we have treats demand and supply in an equitable way. It thinks about the role that interconnection with the rest of Europe can play. At the moment we're poorly interconnected to the rest of Europe. We have 4 gigawatts of interconnection, which is quite small for an economy of our size. So alongside gas, alongside flexible demand and potentially storage, I think that will be the key to managing this more complicated system we have. And that equity is really important to do what the title of this debate says, which is to do it at lowest cost. In other words, if it's lower cost to have flexible demand than building new power stations, then let's go for that. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Before we open it to the floor, Andrea, is there anything you wanted to come back up there?
I think in terms of the costs and clarity, I mean, I think there has been criticism for having a policy change, which as a Conservative, I find extraordinary, because, of course, literally, the old policies were a bottomless pit, and it's the old magic money tree, which if anyone wants 100 quid, help yourselves. There's plenty more where this came from. And so, you know, from a business perspective, businesses need transparency, and therefore they also need to know that there isn't going to be the day of reckoning. And so, I mean, as somebody who doesn't have a background in energy, coming into it, there was always going to be a day of reckoning. Why would anyone think that wasn't going to happen? The subsidies were always they weren't keeping up with the reduction in the cost of deployment. So the day of reckoning was inevitable, and I'm amazed that anyone is surprised at the fact that we've come in and said, no, you can't do this to the bill payer. So that's really the only point I'd like to make in retort, perhaps, to all the criticism.
I'm sure there are lots of questions. Before, and just the usual format, you can just say your name and your vague affiliation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, James. It's Charles Perry, 20 years in energy, both on the clean side and the dirty side. I welcome this discussion there's some differences, but I think there's definitely common ground. And I would agree with the Minister that the carrots and the sticks at the moment are not working effectively, given what we all want to do, which is really reduce pollution and move to a cleaner future. Now, surely VW has actually helped us by highlighting the problem, which is pollution. Now, why should the bill payer actually be picking up the costs for pollution anyway? Surely we should have a simple polluter pays principle. The more you pollute, the more you pay. The less you pollute and the greener you are, you're rewarded. Surely that's a much more sensible thing than all of us having to pick up the costs for renewables.
Claire, would you like to say?
Well, I suppose in terms of the energy sector, we do have the carbon price support mechanism, which has been put in place, and part of that was try to encourage new investment in the lower carbon. At the same time, it was being targeted at the higher carbon polluters. I suppose there has been some change in that policy when it first came in, and there wasn't maybe a consistency, and now it's, it has been frozen. But I suppose we would tend to look at that type of arrangement is something that we would support, and certainly on gas and new gas, I think having a carbon price support mechanism that's working, and that there is a transparency out over a number of years, and there's not a risk of being frozen or changed or whatever, would provide some direction of travel for investors to invest in the right type of technology.
Dominic Martin from Statoil, which is a Norwegian oil and gas company, so I'm very grateful to Professor Watson for pointing out that Norway is playing an important role in supporting the UK's energy security. My question really is for you, Claire. You're talking about the failure of market signals to incentivise new CCGT build. What needs to change about the way the market is constructed to incentivise new gas build, in your opinion?
Well, I think if I had that answer, I'd be making a lot of money for myself personally. A number of groups have looked at this, and in fact even the Competition and Markets Authority has, in their review, would have looked at the market as well. Can you hear? Yeah. I think there's not a simple answer. I think the rapid rise of renewables on the system and the impact that's had on market prices has changed the sort of the structure, and changed where particularly gas plants can look for sources of revenue. I think for us, I suppose looking at the carbon and having a sort of a pathway there around carbon to allow people to invest in the new stuff, and then with looking at the wholesale electricity market liquidity is something that for us is an issue. I suppose it's fair to say we're disappointed that the CMA did not look more closely at the wholesale electricity market. There is a lack of transparency there, both in pricing. We're talking today on the panel, we've talked on a number of occasions about older plant retiring and closing, yet we're not seeing that sort of scarcity coming through on the market, and it's not clear, I suppose, amongst economists as to why that's happening. But I think it's there are a number of issues, and I think there's not a simple answer.
Hi, I'm Jack Holson from Youth Pendragon. Question for the whole panel, really. In light of the repeated failures of the CCS competition over the years, and Drax's recent decision to withdraw from that, what do you think the prospects for CCS are in the UK?
Yeah, I'm not hugely optimistic. I mean, it's been one of the great survivors of policy across several governments, has this commitment to demonstrating CCS. And if you look at all the analysis of how different countries meet climate change targets, often lowest cost analyses, they will often have a lot of CCS in there, but that really depends on CCS being technically viable but also economic as well, just the same as all the other low carbon technologies. In order to get to that place, a number of countries have to then demonstrate it to show technically you can do it, and try and discover what the cost's going to be, which may be high to start with. But having £1 billion still in circulation for potential competition, given the spending reviews coming up, I'd be surprised if it survived, but not that that's what I want the outcome to be. I think it ought to survive, because I think a number of countries around the world should be demonstrating this technology to see if it's an option, because if it isn't, that's really quite important for a number of strategies of many countries.
One of the things that I hear coming out of the conversations I have is CCS on industrial plants, and actually how in many ways for some of the energy intensive industries, you just can't change the chemical processes that you have to go through to produce steel or aluminium, and so actually CCS is one of the only solutions out there. And so I think actually that looking at CCS in industrial clusters is quite exciting.
Andrea, was Drax's
Yeah.
decision a surprise?
No, it wasn't a surprise, and I've just literally come back from the G20 energy ministers meeting in Istanbul last week, and talking in bilaterals to the Chinese energy minister and several energy ministers. They are all looking at both industrial CCS as well as straight from power plants. And I have to say, you know, as I said in my early remarks, we hope to be a world leader in CCS. Is that a hint? Possibly? Yes, okay.
I'll take the hint.
It's good to have agreement. Another question, please, here on.
Hi, Dara, I'm just a party member. I'm interested in the policy focus between the demand side and the supply side. And I sort of, firstly, I wonder, has reducing our usage suffered as a result of governments tending to focus on the generation side, because it's a more visible way of having a low carbon economy? And secondly, is this, as a sort of more financially restrained time, is now an opportunity to focus on reducing our demand and becoming more energy efficient?
So, I mean, this really goes to the heart of, you know, the last Parliament. So the Energy Department has always been in Labour hands or Liberal Democrat hands. Okay, so I'm going to completely go away here from sort of the past and say that what we haven't had is a conservative energy policy. What we have had is a policy that picks the winners. So why on earth would anyone choose to provide huge subsidies for wind and solar with nothing to deal with the intermittency problem? So there was no subsidy for storage, there was no real effort to ensure that energy could be stored. And of course it's always been subsidies as well. It doesn't have to be subsidies. There's more ways to skin a cat. There's more ways, you know, governments have more policy tools at their fingertips than simply bill payers paying for it through subsidies, which are by definition inflexible and not quick to change. And as we've just seen, when you do try and change them, there's a complete outcry from businesses who insist that it was unforeseeable. I mean, I do think the interesting thing is that since announcing the early closure of the RO for onshore wind, almost I think all of the energy companies have been to see us to say, well, could we have a contract for difference with no subsidy? So, you know, suddenly you can do it with no subsidy, whereas last week you couldn't, which is just amazing. So, you know, I certainly think that a conservative energy policy, and I also would argue, I mean, I would absolutely argue you can do more with less. You know, the fact that we're in austere times doesn't mean that a coherent energy strategy that incentivises the deployment of new technologies and lower carbon technologies can't be achieved. Of course it can. It's just how you do it. And I think everyone in this room must agree that throwing money at something isn't just the solution to everything.
Well, I suppose ESB is an independent generator in GB, so I suppose we wouldn't have much exposure to the demand side issues in this market. But I suppose looking at what we're doing, for example, ESB is an Irish utility, and so looking at what we're doing in Ireland, we have invested in an electric vehicle infrastructure, and part of that is looking to see would EVs, if you have a certain uptake of them, would they be able to start acting as almost energy storage for the system, and particularly in Ireland there's a lot of renewable energy that quite often is blowing at night, and that could be used to charge up, and then your car battery perhaps might be used throughout the day to sort of even up some of the peaks. So we have looked at some of that.
Thanks. Just a brief comment on the no subsidy CFD. I think that's very welcome if that's what they're wanting. And in a sense, what that contract does is just take away a lot of the risks they will face. You know, even if it's subsidy free, which actually echoes the way in which a number of plants have been built during the post-privatisation period. So the early dash for gas plants were built on the back of 15-year contracts for their power and 15-year contracts for their gas, and so the risk was shared, and they could therefore, you know, put in the capital investment. I mean, I'd agree with the premise of your question on demand. I think successive governments for a long, long time have neglected it, partly because it is invisible, it's dispersed. You're dealing with, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of businesses, millions of households, and so it's more difficult than saying, well, let's deal with 6 generators or 6 plus a number of independents and 70 power stations. You know, just looking at electricity. And I've been heartened, at least behind the scenes, that within Department of Energy and Climate Change there's been a lot of thinking recently about, well, okay, what can we do? And no doubt there'll be announcements in due course. And thinking about all the different tools that are available, you know, not just subsidies, but standards, prices, persuasion and other things. Because I think, you know, if we can get that policy mix right, as has been illustrated by some of the more successful policies we've had, such as loft insulation programmes in the past, then I think it can help deliver the goals we need at lower cost than just looking at the supply side. I think it's really absolutely essential we do it.
I agree with all of that, and you've stolen some of my points. The one thing I would add, though, is that I guess energy efficiency in households enables households to take control of their own energy bills. And so, in a world where we've basically got to invest, bills are going to go up whether we like it or not. Energy efficiency is the way in which you manage that, and there is a lot of for people who do take the time to switch. There's a lot of benefit. And a lot of reduction in cost that can come to yearly household bills.
There's a question at the back.
Hi there, Richard Hume, I'm the Deputy Regional Chairman for the North East. I've been an energy consultant throughout my life. Question perhaps to the Minister, or indeed to all of you. What is a CFD if it is in some form of tariff? And you can't say that something is without subsidy and then set up prices at different levels depending on what people bid in. The CFD is very welcome, however, so I would make that point. The follow-up question on that, before you answer that question, would be, you can say that you want to remove subsidies in the renewables industry, but you have to replace it with something. This year we've had no CFD through solar, nothing for wind so far as I know. When is the government going to get its act together on that? And when we're going to know next year, for example, are we going to have CFD in the sectors or not?
So, in answer to your first point, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, I struggle as well with the concept of a contract for difference. That obviously, what it is in a sense is the bill payer underwriting the risk to the producer, and that's a bad position to put the bill payer in. And of course, you know, the reason a lot of people are cross about the levy control framework being bust is because they hadn't realised that as the price of wholesale comes down, so the cost to the bill payer goes up, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it is. I mean, intellectually I agree with you. It's an odd way to do anything, particularly when the bill payer is sort of bearing all of the risk. However, the CFD has actually introduced competition. So competition is absolutely key to energy. For in order to get new projects done, that competitive CFD auction, I think, is absolutely vital. It's got to play a part in the future, unless we decide to completely not do it that way at all and to do it some other way. And I think, you know, for my money, I think we've had a radical sort of policy rethink. We've sort of, you know, we've changed a lot, we've stopped a lot, and what I don't want is for there to be a long period of time where there's just a vacuum. So I think that then limits how radical you can be, at least in the short term. And certainly one of the things that businesses have said, for example, about the capacity mechanism, the capacity market, is that they want there to be certainty. They don't want us to sort of completely rethink it. You know, if there's going to be change, it needs to be sort of incremental and not revolution. So does that answer your first point? I mean, I agree with you. It's an odd term. Is that it?
Yeah, I think the CFD, so long as it produces a sensible price. I think if you look at places like India and elsewhere, sometimes you get ridiculous then you really need to find a way as well to make sure that those people that win these auctions actually build out.
Yeah.
Completely crazy price.
Well, yeah. And no, that we absolutely are doing. I mean, where we have tightened up the rules is around not allowing people to kind of lowball a bid and then sort of fail, you know, just in the hope that they bring the overall settlement price down. So I think we're absolutely addressing that. In answer to your other point of when will we announce a CFD, I mean, that is subject to the spending review. You know, this has been an election year, and so, you know, we have said that we will be announcing CFDs soon, and in the context of the spending review, that means within a few weeks, a month or so. You know, it's soon anyway. So in the scheme of things, you know, May to October, that's not a massively lengthy period of uncertainty.
Sorry, just quickly, because I'm Richard's colleague, does that link in with an announcement on subsidies as well, or like in terms of the CFD and changes to subsidies and the ROC yet?
Well,
solar, for example.
Yeah, okay, so the solar consultation ends on the 23rd of October. And of course, then we'll need a period of time to evaluate the feedback and to make some decisions. So I'm going to say probably before the end of this year, all will be made clear, and that's sort of allowing quite a lot of flexibility. But I mean, we certainly want to make some announcements sooner rather than later.
Claire, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just back on your comment about the need for the likes of CFDs and capacity auctions. I think if you look, and the Minister had referred to in her opening remarks about the level of investment that's required in the market, you know, the structure of the energy sector is changing. And you know, if you look at the big players, the big six, balance sheet necessarily of some of those isn't going to be sufficient to deliver the investment that's needed for this market. So in that sense, EMR, which was Electricity Market Reform, which brought in the CFDs and the capacity auction, one of its main objectives was to try and encourage new investment in new sources of finance. And in that sort of market, you know, people will look at the UK and think, well, yes, but they have been burned in other markets. So people investing in the sector are looking for some sort of policy certainty, some sort of protection to allow them to be able to invest. So part of it is to do with the level of investment required.
Another question at the back there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wouldn't wish to disagree with anything that's been said amongst the panel today, and it's a very important discussion. But I wonder whether we could just look a bit broader. My name's Ken Pollock, I'm actually from Worcestershire County Council. But while I was here, I actually received an email which sort of says, if I read a couple of sentences, India is opening a mine a month as it races to double coal output by 2020. Other Asian nations are increasingly looking to coal to power their economies too. Japan alone plans to build another 41 new coal-fired power stations. And we know that Germany is replacing nuclear with coal, including lignite, and Holland has just had a derogation so it can build a brand new coal-fired power station, coal-fired power station. And I just wonder whether we are actually crippling our own economy when other people are taking a more long-term view and having less concern about the CO2 we're all talking about. And I have a feeling that Paris, India and China and other nations are going to make us look very foolish because they're going to stick it up in something which they're going to get through and we're going to feel restricted on.
Are we crippling our own economy, Jim?
Yeah, I think if you'd said that quote 5 or 10 years ago, you could have replaced the word India with the word China. I worked a lot in China at the time, and yes, they were building a coal-fired power station every week, as the story goes. But China has shifted a long way from that point, and working with the US, I've been really heartened by how far those two countries have gone to really put pressure on each other to take some leadership, because that leadership was what was absent in Copenhagen the last time we hoped for a big climate deal. I think we've also lowered our expectations about what can be achieved. So I think the fact that some countries are building coal-fired power stations is not our get-out-of-jail-free card. It's all committing carbon to the atmosphere. China has very much changed its position. You have to remember also India is a much poorer country. Its per capita emissions are much, much lower than those in China. So it's a long way behind. So I wouldn't personally expect India to be putting in place the kind of ambitious plans China is now. You probably expect that to happen 10 years or 15 years hence. And also there's the point about leadership. You know, if we and other countries who are leading, whether it's the US or Germany or others, don't do this stuff and demonstrate it can be done, then why should the likes of the Indian government, with all the people it has to lift out of poverty, take any notice?
Yeah. Andrea, on the Paris talks, what do you think?
So, I mean, on the Paris talks, our strategy is very clear. We are absolutely promoting the decarbonisation of the world. And so we're not seeking to be out there taking all the pain on behalf of everybody else. What we're seeking to do is, by example, showing that we will be amongst the best rather than amongst the worst. So I think it's exactly right that leadership is required. And I think the other thing I would point out is that actually decarbonisation has now dropped its link with GDP growth. So as we're increasing our decarbonisation, so our GDP is growing. So the old belief that in order to decarbonise you needed to take a hit in your wallet is actually proving increasingly not to be true. And I mean, certainly, you know, we've got very successful renewables industries now. I just last week visited the new Siemens site in Hull, which is going to be one of the world's biggest blade producers. and their books are full until 2020, exporting blades around the world. Britain already has half the world's offshore wind. I mean, these things, this is a new industry. This is something which Britain is going to be a world leader in. We've got gaps in our supply chain, which we're really keen to sort of promote to make sure that we're best in class. But actually, the export story is going to be a great piece of it. And I completely agree that when you look at countries like India, true to say they're not about to ditch coal because they can't afford to. You look at China, they're going to absolutely thrash their own internal targets for decarbonisation, just because once they get going on it, they can achieve things so much faster than we can. So actually, we need to show leadership, but we can actually do that without having to take a massive amount of pain.
I think the other thing about China is that it's realised the economic benefits of promoting its renewables sector, and so actually it might be that it's you hear stories about what it's doing in terms of coal or whatever, but I mean the truth is it's also building technologies and companies that it can export abroad, and it's sort of, in a way, it's realised the economic advantage here, and the risk for us is that it overtakes us.
But by dumping solar PVs on the German market, 12 German solar PV companies have gone bankrupt.
There's another question in the middle.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd be interested in the views of all the panel, but it's one on departmental organisation. We heard earlier today from St Giles Trust, and that they and quangos and associations interested in penal reform, the justice ticket, and excellent organisations like Monitor in the health sector, I believe, help government departments to do a great job. Andrea, would you consider hiving off all your climate change advisors in your department, forming a self-funding quango or other organisation, and letting them do for your department what those other excellent quangos do for the other departments?
Well, you're kind of tempting me here to probably talk about things I absolutely shouldn't talk about. That's really tempting. I mean, well, an example of one thing we have done, of course, is the Oil and Gas Authority. So that is an example of hiving off because of the unique needs and the speed of sort of the disinvestment in the North Sea. So the Oil and Gas Authority is set up, largely by a DEC staff, being tasked with a specific focus to maximise the economic recovery from the North Sea. So that is one example of where we have actually done it. Of course, on the climate change, we have the climate change panel who who largely set our targets and assess how we're doing against them and so on. So to a certain extent, we've already done that with climate change. I mean, there's some other areas I would love to get into thinking about, because I do think actually, personally, I feel there's a lot to be said for having, I mean, I'm a big fan, for example, of the PRA and the MPC and the FCA in banking, so you can see I'd absolutely, and actually another thing which I just do find slightly extraordinary is since Liz Truss isn't responsible for Tesco running out of bread, it seems amazing that Amber Rudd is responsible if your light doesn't switch on. So I think, intellectually there's a lot that you could consider and think about, but it's probably not something to, chew the fat on here.
There's a question, Mr. Chairman, before perhaps some other panel members, may I? Andrea, I believe that you should hold on to the responsibility for keeping the lights on.
Mm-hmm.
It's the,
yes, we always would, ultimately.
The polar bears are okay, or sea level is rising. That should principally, I believe, be the responsibility for arm's length organisations, and those that we know that are in that space are doing an excellent job.
Yeah.
There's another question in the back.
I'm a councillor from Fylde. I have no links with any energy providers. I'm not an expert. But I specifically want to ask a question about shale gas, because some of you may know that Fylde has been in the spotlight because Quadrilla have been actively pursuing applications to explore for shale gas, not to produce, but to explore. And I noticed that in the question it was talking about the price, the cost to the taxpayer, and I just want to point out that not only is there a cost to the taxpayer in terms of what they pay through their bills, but how we provide energy, there is a cost to local communities in terms of the local impact and the extent to which, if we pursue shale gas development, mitigation is enough to enable that development to go ahead. Locally, the Borough Council, I'm a Borough Councillor, have knocked back the 2 applications. They're only consultees. The Lancashire County Council and the Minerals Authority, they've also rejected both applications. But it's likely, in fact, it's almost certain that the quadrilla will go to appeal. There is a feeling on the ground in local communities that of confusion. The anti-fracking industry is very aggressive and very much on the front foot. And I do believe, despite Quadrilla's best efforts, there has been a lack of a campaign to actually promote the positive benefits of shale gas, and also attempts by government and Quadrilla to alleviate the pain, and there will be pain in terms of local impact, and this argument about local impact and national benefits comes in here. And I just want to put that to the Minister and to the panel. I'm agnostic about shale gas. I think there's a possibility it can be done safely and productively, but I have to take on board huge local concern in terms of shale gas and the impact locally. So I'd like to put that to the Minister and invite any other comments from the panel.
Sure, maybe we'll hear from some of the rest of the panel before we go to Andrea.
Yeah.
Jim, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. The debate is often very confused. In fact, you have overselling of the risks from the anti-lobby, but also I think certainly in the earlier days, some of the developers were probably guilty of overselling the potential benefits, or at least how quickly we might get them in terms of reducing bills, in terms of huge amounts of contribution to our energy supply. I mean, I think whatever happens, you're right. You're absolutely right to emphasise this is about exploration. And if we're going to have a shale gas industry in the UK, we do have to go through this exploration phase. We can't just take the experience of the US and plant it in the UK because our geology is different and so on. So that's going to have to happen. If it does happen, to get that public consent, regulation, as the Minister says, is going to be really, really important environmentally. But I think, mitigation of impacts locally is also going to be important as well. And then if it produces, then, why not share those gains between the nation and the local area? But again, I would extend that to lots of different energy developments as well, rather than it just being a focus for shale. So I guess my headline on this is there's a lot of nonsense talked across the spectrum. A more evidence-based debate is required, but we do have to actually go and do the exploration before we really know what position we're in and what the potential is.
Rian, do you think business has a role to play here in sort of promoting the benefits as well as the possible side effects of shale to the nation?
Yeah, and I think there's work going on to do that. I guess I think where shale is interesting is as a feedstock for some of the industrial sectors, and helps them manage their costs and rising costs and their security of supply, and I think that's worth exploring. I guess your comments though made me think about some of the challenges around the costs and the way in which we're just not going to be able to replicate here what's been done in the US, that the challenge of doing it at scale enough to reduce the costs in the way that was happened in the US, I think is going to be harder to replicate in the UK for the reasons you set out.
I think it probably requires a sort of a broader communication, broader sort of discussion amongst the various groups, whether it's any one party is responsible for extolling the benefits, whatever, of what they're doing. And if you think more broadly within the energy sector, there really is a need for a very mature discussion amongst consumers and local communities with policymakers and energy companies around what do they want to see in the future, what they're willing to pay for it, and what the impacts and benefits are. So I think it's a much broader discussion. It's not solely on shale gas, but I think it does impact across energy. Certainly on, for example, if I take gas generation development that we're involved in ourselves, the fact that there are public documents, talking about the actual benefits of gas generation to the economy means that question is essentially answered, and then you move on to the local issues at that stage. So maybe something similar might be of use.
So I completely agree with the need to seriously take into account the concerns of local communities. I mean, I came into the energy department with a lot of years of experience in finance, so how to finance things, but not actually the energy side of it itself. And so one of the first things I wanted to understand is, do I think that shale gas, you know, as a process, as a regulated activity, as something that is a possible source of energy for the UK, do I think it stacks up? So the two things I wanted to know about were the science of climate change and the process of shale gas. And I can tell you, I'm deeply sceptical, deeply cynical. I'm a huge fan of my own local community and have protected them to my dying death. I've got HS2 going through my constituency and so on. So I totally understand the need for protection of local communities. And I am absolutely convinced that we can exploit shale safely. I think we have the best regulation in the world. We've learnt lessons from the US experience. Enormously. We keep tweaking things. I mean, I'm on the record as saying if there's anything we can do that would give local communities more reassurance that doesn't sort of somehow wreck the ability to exploit the shale, then we should do it. So if that means, you know, more independence, more oversight. So some of the things DEC are doing now is pre and post groundwater monitoring to give people reassurance that their groundwater isn't being damaged. There's all sorts. We've got independent well inspectors, and all of the health and safety for the local environment as well as for the people is being absolutely looked at with a magnifying glass. In addition, of course, the local planning is absolutely fundamental to this. So the local planning authority are being given as much information as they need to help them to understand the process, and are being encouraged to make the right decisions around the planning implications. They're not being interfered with, they're not being bullied or badgered to do things that they're not comfortable with. But so what we're trying to do, and I do accept the criticism that we've not done well enough on the comms side, completely accept that criticism, and it's something I'm trying to really focus on now. But what I can assure you here in this room is that we are really trying to create an environment that communities can say, well, actually, let's give it a go. This seems fine to me. I'm satisfied that there's enough rigour around the processes, and of course, importantly, that there's something in it for me. Now, I hope no one's just going to tweet, Minister says we're just going to bribe them, because that isn't the point at all. The first and foremost is the safety and the absolute conviction, yeah, actually this isn't going to harm me or my family or my children in school, and it's not going to clog up my roads, and I won't be able to see it. Those are absolutely vital. But then so too is there something in it for the community, and that's the other side of it that we're trying to ensure that there is real community benefit. So we've said 100,000 per explored well and 1% of revenues from any site. Those things are important to communities. It could mean a new preschool, you know, it could mean all manner of things that local communities want. And so that balance has to be got right, and that's what I'm determined to achieve.
And we've probably got time for one last quick question. At the back there.
Yeah, my name is Karen Potter with the Sustainability Hub. I just wondered, there was a lot of discussion today about renewable subsidies, and I wondered whether fossil fuel subsidies are under review as well.
We don't have any. What fossil fuel subsidies are you referring to?
Well, fossil fuel subsidies, I mean, the IMF did a report earlier this year which estimated that it was something along the line of $10 million a minute, I think, in terms of bringing together all of fossil fuel subsidies from across the board. So the impacts of burning fossil fuels, the support that the government gives across a whole range of areas.
But you're not really pointing to it that we don't have fossil fuel subsidies in the UK, unless someone's going to tell me.
No, I'm afraid we do. So Ben Goldsmith actually stepped in for Oliver Lectren the other day on a platform, and he echoed the evidence that I and others gave to the Environment Audit Committee recently. And in the UK, it's 7 times renewables, fossil fuel subsidies.
But
and it's price support.
Tell me.
So it's price support. So
you're
take out the word
subsidy,
it's price support. It's a number of different things, both on the production and consumption side, which is all about price support.
I mean, you'd have to be more specific. The capacity mechanism.
I'm happy to chat to you afterwards.
Yeah. I mean,
Ben was representing the Conservative Environment Network, and he echoed the evidence that a lot of us know well in the industry, which is 7 times more for fossil fuels than renewables.
Okay. So what is the case with fossil fuels is there is a terrible legacy from fossil fuels, and certainly one of my responsibilities is the coal legacy. And there have been some awful, heartbreaking stories of people who've contracted cancer and respiratory diseases and so on from coal mining legacy. There are also legacies in terms of putting right some of the environmental damage, but there aren't direct fossil fuel subsidies in the way that there are direct renewables subsidies. And I just think, you know, it's very important that, as going right back to the beginning, this is a trilemma. You cannot today switch off all of your fossil fuels and just go to wind and solar. And I mean, anybody who thinks you can do that, it's just clearly, blatantly wrong. So therefore we are where we are, and I think I used that horrible joke which probably offended you. I'm sorry, Claire, but you know, the fact is we've got a huge legacy that we're trying to get away from. And so I would absolutely disagree with you that we have fossil fuel subsidies. In fact, we charge people for carbon. There's the European emissions trading system, which isn't working properly, but it will be. There is a commitment to phasing out unabated coal. We're trying to move more towards gas, clearly as a bridge to decarbonise the future. So I just don't accept the accusation that we're somehow encouraging fossil fuel use. It's the exact opposite of that. Thank you.
I'm happy to send the report. I mean,
Please
I think that'd be good to have a conversation offline.
Increasing field allowances in the North Sea is a form of...
No, it's not. That's a tax reduction.
It's
They
a price
pay
support.
no. They pay far higher taxes. No, it's not a price support. They already pay far higher taxes than corporations do in the UK. Yeah, I'm sorry, but that's wrong.
Okay, well,
The fiscal regime is no way a price support, and
price
nor is it a
intervention.
subsidy.
It's
It's not a price intervention. It's a fiscal regime where the oil and gas sector already pay more than any other company in the UK.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Rian. And thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone, for coming.